Around evening at the Ilsung Height Villa inside a quiet apartment, a young man walked into the living room. There, something immediately caught his attention, a travel suitcase sitting in plain view. The sight of it took him by surprise and he paused, unsure of its meaning. While he didn't ask about it right away, he made a mental note to bring it up with his stepmother the next day. As he stood there, a thought lingered in his mind. He reflected on how people who fall into addiction often begin to lose control over their actions, and with time, they can even lose their sense of identity altogether. With that uneasy thought, he went to check on his stepmother, whom he respectfully called Ajumma. The next morning, he greeted her politely and asked if she had slept well. She acknowledged his greeting and mentioned that she had already prepared breakfast. Curious, he brought up that he had thought she was going to make curry. She responded that he had curry the day before and what she made today was also quite good. She then served him the meal with a small smile of confidence. As he began to eat, he noticed her eyes fixed on him. Her gaze made him feel slightly on edge, and though he tried to stay composed, it was difficult under her silent scrutiny. She explained that she was just watching to see if he liked the taste, but her intense stare made him nervous. He jokingly remarked that eating under that kind of pressure might give him indigestion even if he was full. After the death of his father, his stepmother, CornhwaSama, had been left behind. Once things settled after the funeral and all the necessary arrangements were taken care of, the two of them began living together in the apartment. He still remembered the first time he met her. The impression she left on him that day remained vivid in his memory. She had seemed cold, strict, and even slightly intimidating. Her presence felt distant and reserved, with an air of seriousness that made her seem almost dangerous. But he also remembered something else, that she had told him she had always wished to have a son. He was pulled out of his thoughts when she called his name, reminding him not to pick out the beans from the bowl and to eat everything. She even tried to feed him the beans herself, and although he protested that he wasn't a child anymore, she insisted. In the end, he had no choice but to eat them. Then, as the thought of the suitcase returned to his mind, he mentioned it to her, asking what it was for. She began to explain that now that he was grown up, but before she could finish, the sound of a message notification interrupted her. She quickly checked her phone, then stood up in a rush. Glancing at the time, she remarked that the morning had passed by faster than she realized. She said she was already running late for work and that they could talk more when she returned home later. Before leaving, she reminded him to come back safely from college and not to be late. Later that day, Jywin was at college, walking alongside his friend. The weather was warm, and his friend casually mentioned feeling unusually hot, wondering if it was just him. Jywin simply responded that it probably was, implying it wasn't that hot. Taking that as a challenge, his friend playfully accused Jywin of suggesting he was too skinny, comparing himself to an anchovy. Determined to prove his point, he added that he was more muscular than Jywin and even flexed his thin arms with exaggerated confidence, making a show of his biceps despite their clear lack of bulk. Meanwhile, not far from where they were standing, an upperclassman was trying to talk a female junior, Suyin, into eating lunch with him. Since there were no more classes that day, he used it as an excuse to invite her out. However, Suyin politely but firmly turned him down. Jywin noticed the interaction from a distance. His friend, catching on as well, leaned in and explained that the upperclassman had been persistently bothering Suyin for a while now. Even though she clearly disliked the attention, he kept pushing, refusing to back off. As the situation unfolded, Suyin suddenly spotted Jywin. Her face lit up and she called out to him with enthusiasm, asking if he was heading to college. However, Jywin remained distant and unresponsive, his reaction quiet and detached. His friend nudged him in the side, whispering that Suyin was clearly reaching out to him, not only to chat, but also possibly seeking help to escape the persistent upperclassman. He added that she might even be trying to ask Jywin out. Despite this, Jywin bluntly replied that he had made a promise to his mother and needed to leave early. His friend grew irritated and told him to just make up an excuse to come home late, but Jywin insisted that his mother said she had something important to tell him. Without further explanation, he took his leave. Watching him go, his friend couldn't help but mutter in disbelief, calling Jywin a mama's boy for walking away from both Suyin's request and a clear opportunity. As Jywin made his way home, his thoughts drifted to a memory. He remembered when his stepmother, Haisu, once told him that she would stay by his side until he started college. The words lingered in his mind, especially now. Sitting alone on the bus, he looked troubled, the worry on his face subtle but present. When he finally arrived home, he noticed something strange. The apartment was dark. None of the lights were on, which was unusual. He stepped in cautiously and turned on the lights. The moment the room lit up, he saw clothing scattered messily on the floor, giving the impression that someone had left in a hurry. His eyes quickly searched for the suitcase he had seen before, but it was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, he rushed into Haisu's room. She was startled by his sudden entrance and asked what was wrong. Jywin, visibly agitated, explained that he had thought she had left him. The combination of the missing suitcase and the dark apartment had triggered the fear that she might have disappeared without saying anything. Haisu calmly reassured him that she hadn't gone anywhere. She explained that she had simply moved the suitcase and had no intention of leaving. With a steady voice, she promised that she would not abandon him. Despite her words, Jywin still seemed uncertain. Needing comfort, he asked if he could stay with her for the night. Later that night, Jywin was seen lying in bed in his room. The silence was heavy and he stared at the ceiling and thought. Not long after, Haisu quietly entered his room. That night, Haisu quietly chose to spend the night together with Jywin, staying by his side. The atmosphere was quiet, though no words were spoken about the arrangement. The next scene shifted to a rainy day at a high school. Outside, the rain poured steadily and Jywin stood near the school building without an umbrella. A female classmate stood nearby, proudly showing off her umbrella, mentioning that her mother had thoughtfully prepared it for her. When Jywin asked if they could share it at least until the nearest convenience store, the girl hesitated and then refused. She explained that the umbrella was too small to cover both of them, insisting it was a mini umbrella, and walked off by herself. Left standing in the rain, Jywin couldn't help but feel a little self-conscious. He wondered if she had refused to share the umbrella because of something unpleasant. Maybe he smelled bad? But he quickly reminded himself that he showered every day. Before he could dwell on it too long, the girl turned around briefly and snapped that her refusal had nothing to do with that, then left him behind in the rain. As he stood there debating whether to wait out the rain, Jywin was unexpectedly surprised to see Haisu arriving. She was drenched from head to toe, clearly having rushed over without any concern for getting wet. She held up an umbrella, saying that she had realized he forgot his and came to bring it to him. She admitted that she was in such a hurry that she only brought one umbrella. Without hesitation, the two of them began walking together under the single umbrella. As they walked, she casually asked him what he would like to eat for dinner that night, making the moment feel normal despite how soaked she was. The following day, Haisu was at her workplace. She sat at her desk, her face pale and the dark circles under her eyes impossible to miss. She silently acknowledged to herself that she hadn't gotten a single minute of sleep the night before. She recalled that she had intended to leave Jywin's room once he fell asleep, but he had seemed tense and self-aware the entire night, preventing her from slipping away. Now she felt a growing sense of urgency. She had to find a solution, and fast. Turning to her computer, she searched online for forums and resources related to her situation. She found a thread that introduced an agency offering help in circumstances like hers and considered contacting them. Just as she was deep in thought, her subordinate, Jihu, startled her with his sudden appearance, asking if she was okay. He pointed out that she looked very pale. In response, she asked him if she really looked that bad and then quickly shut off her computer. She told Jihu she would be heading out early to meet someone and that he could leave whenever he finished his own work. Jihu agreed but quietly assumed she was just stressed out about the current project. He noted to himself that Haisu had a habit of over-worrying about work, which he considered both her flaw and her strength, something he secretly admired about her. Later, Haisu was seen sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, waiting as she stirred her drink absent-mindedly. Her friend soon arrived, taking a seat across from her and immediately noticing something was off. With a knowing look, she remarked that Haisu appeared deeply troubled, specifically about a man. Haisu was taken aback and asked how her friend had figured that out. Her friend simply pointed out that it was written all over her face, clear as day. She then asked if Haisu had canceled her upcoming trip because of this mysterious man. After a brief pause, Haisu admitted that she had. Her friend, clearly surprised, commented that she always believed Haisu would be fine without having a man in her life and asked who this man was that had affected her so much. When Haisu calmly answered that it was her stepson, her friend was so shocked that she accidentally spat her drink straight into Haisu's face. Without losing her composure, Haisu gave her a cold look and said she'd let it go this time, but warned her not to do it again. Her friend quickly apologized and handed her a napkin to wipe her face, trying to compose herself before asking Haisu to explain what exactly was going on with Jywin. Haisu looked uncertain, admitting that she didn't even know where to begin. Eventually, she gathered her thoughts and shared everything that had happened, step by step. Her friend listened carefully, growing visibly more alarmed with each detail. When Haisu finished, her friend asked why she hadn't pushed Jywin away more firmly. Haisu responded that because she wasn't his biological mother, she felt it was only right to be kinder to him, perhaps more lenient than she should have been. Without another word, her friend suddenly stood up, clearly determined. She told Haisu to go home and promised she would figure something out, but insisted that Haisu must not interfere. Haisu, unsure, asked if her friend was certain she could handle it. Her friend gave a confident nod, saying she could so long as Haisu agreed to leave everything to her. With that, the two left the coffee shop together. Back at home, Jywin was sitting quietly when he noticed a notification on his phone. It was a message from Haisu, one that had arrived 20 minutes earlier, mentioning that her friend would be coming over. Just as he finished reading the message, he heard the sound of the door opening. Haisu and her friend stepped inside, and her friend called out cheerfully, saying that she had brought ice cream for him. Although the air was casual, there was a moment of quiet disbelief in Haisu's friend, Kyunga, when she caught sight of Jywin again, taller now, his features more defined, carrying the kind of composure that only time could grant. Her thoughts involuntarily drifted back to a simpler time when he was still a child tugging at her sleeve with schoolbooks in hand, hoping she'd assist him with his homework. Despite his request back then, she would always feign ignorance, insisting that she had never been the studious type and wasn't equipped to help him. Instead of offering guidance, she would often change the subject abruptly, one time diverting the conversation toward recounting her recent trip to Jeju Island, trying to charm her way out of the moment, to which he would usually brush off with a quiet determination to handle it himself. Now, standing in the present, the contrast left her momentarily stunned by how grown up he had become. His presence was no longer that of the boy who once hovered over homework assignments, but of a young man who now carried himself with ease and confidence. As Jywin approached, he greeted her with familiar warmth, and though it was meant to be comforting, it left her momentarily frozen. His casual comment, suggesting that nothing had changed and she looked exactly the same, was meant as a light-hearted reflection, but she sensed something deeper in his voice. Realizing her unease, he quickly attempted to dispel the tension, his tone softening as he admitted that he was simply happy to see her again. Watching the interaction unfold, Haisu couldn't help but feel a stir of unease herself. Kyunga, who had previously hinted that she might be blunt or critical when the topic of Jywin came up, was now behaving with an unusual gentleness. Her sudden friendliness felt out of place, bordering on performative. Unable to keep her thoughts to herself, Haisu curtly reminded Kyunga that the ice cream they had bought was beginning to melt, an indirect nudge meant to disrupt the atmosphere. Seizing the opportunity, Kyunga invited Jywin to join her in eating the ice cream, her voice laced with casual charm, while Haisu looked on with growing uncertainty. Despite the innocent setting, a sense of doubt lingered in her mind, gnawing quietly. Was Kyunga someone she could really trust around Jywin? That concern only deepened later when Kyunga found herself alone in Jywin's room. Casually observing the photos on his desk and shelves, snapshots of memories, frozen moments that gave away the subtle growth of his life. Her voice carried a playful curiosity as she asked whether he was currently seeing anyone. His response came without hesitation. He wasn't, and he added that he simply preferred the comfort of living with Haisu. Kyunga, never one to let a remark slide without commentary, teased that if he kept on like this, he would eventually turn into a mama's boy. Jywin, unbothered, simply shrugged off the remark, stating that it didn't really concern him. After all, he wasn't particularly interested in anyone else anyway. As the quiet conversation between Kyunga and Jywin unfolded in the room, something shifted within Kyunga. The pieces were falling into place, and she finally understood the root of Haisu's concern, the subtle, ever-deepening attachment Jywin held toward her. With a calm yet thoughtful tone, Kyunga began to explain to Jywin that it was natural, especially when young, to feel drawn to someone older. She emphasized that such feelings, though powerful, could often lead to confusion, making it hard to separate genuine connection from something idealized. But Jywin's response came with the firm clarity of someone who had already sorted through his emotions. He didn't seem confused. He didn't hesitate. He stated simply and directly that he felt happiest whenever he was with Haisu. That was all there was to it. It wasn't about projection or misunderstanding, it was the feeling itself that he held onto, and he had no desire to be apart from her. Kyunga was taken aback. The conviction in his voice was far from naive, it was grounded, sincere, and unshaken. At that moment, she realized that this was far more serious than she had anticipated. With this newfound urgency, she stood up and walked to the door. As she opened it, she found Haisu standing just outside, hesitating at the threshold as if unsure whether to come in. Without revealing much of the conversation, Kyunga asked Haisu to step out just for an hour and come back later. Haisu, puzzled and a little suspicious, questioned the need for such secrecy, insisting that whatever was being discussed could be done with her present. However, Kyunga was firm. She stated that Haisu's presence was distracting for the moment, giving no room for argument as she gently but purposefully closed the door behind her and turned the lock. As the lock clicked into place, Kyunga's expression shifted into one of quiet resolve. She wasn't doing this out of malice, but out of fear that if left unspoken, something precious might be lost again. She thought of the past, of the people Haisu had already lost. To Kyunga, this was her chance to step in before things spiraled beyond repair. Within the room, she turned back to Jywin, no longer in the role of a playful friend but of someone trying to intervene. Her goal now was to challenge his certainty, not to mock or belittle it, but to put it to the test. She needed him to see that if his happiness was so deeply tied to Haisu alone, then perhaps he hadn't yet opened himself to the wider world, to other connections or possibilities. In her heart, she hoped she could still redirect what felt like a dangerous path, that she could prove to him that his happiness didn't have to begin and end with just one person, even someone as important as Haisu. While Kyunga remained behind closed doors, trying to reach through the layers of emotion and certainty that surrounded Jywin's attachment to Haisu, the woman in question sat alone on a gently creaking swinging chair just outside, tucked within the quiet corners of the neighborhood. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen of her phone, the message she had sent moments ago still visible, her contact details forwarded to the agency she had come across earlier on a forum, a decision made on impulse. Driven by something she couldn't fully explain. She told herself it was simply curiosity, that there was no harm in exploring new opportunities. But as she tapped her fingers anxiously against her knee, she realized it wasn't curiosity that had driven her, it was restlessness. A strange and growing impatience was clawing at her chest, though she had no clear reason why. It wasn't like Kyunga to overstep. It wasn't like Jywin to hide things from her. And yet, something about the locked door and the private conversation unsettled her in a way she couldn't dismiss. After a few more moments of resisting the urge, Haisu stood up from the swinging chair. She told herself that an hour must have passed already, and whatever they needed to talk about would surely be over by now. With that reasoning, she walked back toward the house, determination quiet but firm in her steps. Inside the room, Kyunga and Jywin were finishing up a workout, one meant to test his limits, challenge his focus, and push his body and mind away from his emotional dependence. It had been more than just exercise, it was Kyunga's method of breaking through, showing him that there were other forms of happiness, other ways to feel alive. She told him not to mention what they had just done, to keep it between the two of them for now. But before Jywin could respond, the door creaked open. Haisu stepped inside, her presence immediate and disarming. Her eyes scanned the room, Jywin slightly flushed, Kyunga with her arms crossed and posture stiff. Something in the air felt different, charged. With a neutral tone edged in subtle suspicion, Haisu asked what they were doing. Both Kyunga and Jywin were caught off guard by Haisu's sudden return, the door swinging open before either had the chance to compose themselves. The tension that hung in the room was swiftly replaced by a startled silence as Haisu's eyes darted between them, curious and mildly suspicious. Kyunga, ever quick to regain her footing, forced a nervous smile as she searched for a believable explanation. Her gaze landed on the small puddle of melted ice cream on the table nearby, an oversight that unexpectedly came to her rescue. Feigning casualness, Kyunga pointed it out and explained that Jywin had accidentally spilled the ice cream earlier and had to clean himself off, hence the delay and the state they were in. Picking up on her cue, Jywin nodded and confirmed her story without adding much detail, his tone carefully neutral. Satisfied that the story held up, Kyunga quickly shifted the conversation, asking if Haisu was all right. She gently acknowledged that Haisu must have come back out of concern and reassured her that there was no longer anything to worry about. With a lightness she had clearly rehearsed in her mind, Kyunga added that Jywin had probably been too focused on his studies to properly understand certain emotional matters, but she had taken the time to talk things through with him. Now that he had a better grasp of things, she was confident the situation would improve going forward. She concluded with a subtle suggestion, encouraging Haisu to continue acting normally around Jywin, not to treat him any differently than she always had. With that, Kyunga gathered her things and took her leave, offering Haisu a warm smile on her way out. Left standing in the quiet room, Haisu was filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. While part of her still harbored unease about the nature of Kyunga's intervention, she couldn't deny the sense of reassurance she now felt. Whatever had happened behind that locked door, it seemed Kyunga had handled it with her usual tact and strength. Elsewhere, in a university lecture hall bustling with students settling into their seats, casual chatter filled the air. Among them was Suryan, seated beside a friend who was venting about a recent confrontation with an upperclassman. The frustration in her voice was unmistakable as she lamented the fallout and the awkward silence that had followed the fight, leaving the two of them barely on speaking terms. A few rows ahead, Jywin sat with his friend Sungbeek in the front row, his attention buried in a book. Sunbeek, spotting Suyin just behind them, nudged Jywin lightly and whispered if he should go greet her. Without lifting his gaze, Jywin replied softly that Suyin was in the middle of a conversation and wouldn't appreciate being interrupted. Meanwhile, Suyin's friend continued her one-sided monologue, rambling now about her laundry habits with her older brother. She complained that he never washed his clothes properly and constantly wore inappropriate outfits around the house. The mundane familiarity of her words struck something in Jywin, the imagery cutting too close to his own private thoughts. Seemingly without warning, he rose from his seat mid-lecture, muttering to Sunbeek that he had just remembered something urgent and had to leave. Sunbeek looked up in surprise, protesting that Jywin was bailing on him after hyping up their post-class plans to hit the game room. But Jywin was already on his way out, not bothering to look back. As the door closed behind him, Suyin turned to Sunbeek, puzzled, and asked if Jywin had just left without attending the lecture. Sunbeek shrugged, still mildly annoyed, and responded that Jywin had said he had some urgent business to take care of. At home, Jywin moved about with an easy rhythm, assuming he had the place to himself. As he approached the laundry area, a mundane but necessary task in his mind, he wondered aloud if Haisu had gone out. Seeing that the laundry was still unattended, a faint sense of relief crossed his face. He was glad to have gotten there first. Glancing over the pile, he muttered to himself about how surprised he still was that women seemed to dislike laundry to such an extent, a thought clearly influenced by past experiences and perhaps the conversation from the lecture earlier. However, his sense of calm was abruptly shattered by the sudden sound of someone behind him. Turning quickly, his eyes widened as he saw Haisu standing just a few steps away. She had been there all along. Haisu, unfazed by his surprise, smiled gently and explained that she had come home early because she wanted to have dinner with him. She mentioned she was planning to make curry his favorite and asked if that would be okay. Caught off guard but visibly pleased, Jywin responded that it was fine, adding that he would come over after he finished the laundry. Later that evening, Haisu sat quietly in her room, her thoughts unsettled. The moment in the laundry room replayed in her mind, not because of what was said, but because of what she sensed beneath the surface. Something in Jywin's reaction, in his behavior, continued to gnaw at her. As she sat there, her phone buzzed beside her. Reaching for it, she saw that it was a message from the agency she had contacted earlier through an anonymous forum. The message was concise but direct. They had seen her post and believed they understood what she was dealing with. They expressed a willingness to help and provided further details for a meeting. Haisu stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she considered the implications. She wondered whether this agency could truly help unravel the complicated feelings and blurred boundaries surrounding Jywin. Was it naive to hope for a solution through strangers? By the next morning, she found herself behind the wheel of her car, heading toward the address she had been given. Her grip on the steering wheel was firm, her expression unreadable. Doubt lingered. Was this a reckless move or a necessary step forward? Despite not knowing exactly what to expect, she had no better alternatives, and for now that was enough. Eventually, the tall facade of Grand Haight came into view. The building stood polished and imposing, its reputation preceding it. As Haisu approached the entrance of the room, a quiet uncertainty settled over her. She hesitated just before reaching the door, her mind weighed down by unease. She had no idea what kind of person awaited her on the other side, and for a moment, the thought of turning back felt like a reasonable option. Her hand lingered near the doorknob, but before she could act on her hesitation, the door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, her expression marked by mild surprise upon seeing Haisu. Without waiting for formalities, she remarked on Haisu's unexpected arrival, wondering aloud why she hadn't been informed beforehand. Haisu, still processing the shift in atmosphere, quietly stated that she had just arrived. With a casual wave, the woman invited her in. Even as she stepped inside, Haisu's apprehension did not subside. She glanced around and hesitated by the threshold, voicing her concern about whether it was really all right for them to speak there. The woman, however, responded with a dry reassurance, saying she had no intention of harming her and again gestured for her to come in. Reluctantly, Haisu followed and took a seat on the sofa. As they settled into the quiet room's quiet, the woman poured them drinks, mentioning that she had thought it would be difficult to have a proper conversation outside, so she had arranged this private setting instead. Without delay, Haisu brought up the reason for her visit. She reminded the woman of her claim that there was supposedly a solution to the problem weighing on her. The woman responded calmly, explaining that many people had come to her with similar concerns and that, despite how overwhelming the issue might have seemed at first, it had actually been surprisingly easy to resolve. She hinted that the answer was just within reach and gestured toward a nearby room, suggesting Haisu take a look. Something about the suggestion made Haisu pause. A faint sense of unease crept into her chest, and though she couldn't shake the bad feeling, she reminded herself of her purpose. This was for Jywin. Drawing in a breath, she opened the door. What met her eyes, however, was entirely unexpected. A workout session was in progress inside the room. Disbelief flickered across her face. Without uttering a word, she backed away and promptly left, her steps swift and resolute. This was not what she had come for, and certainly not what she had envisioned for Jywin. By the time evening fell, a heavy rain blanketed the city. Back at the apartment, Jywin was quietly tending to the laundry indoors, carefully spreading out the damp clothes. The sound of a sudden thud interrupted the rhythm of his work, drawing his attention toward the hallway. There, sprawled on the floor, was Haudu. Alarmed, he rushed over and quickly helped her up. It didn't take long to realize she had been drinking. Her movements were sluggish, her words slightly slurred. Supporting her carefully, he led her into her room. Once there, Haudu murmured something that caught him off guard. She expressed that perhaps they should no longer live together. Her voice, though soft, carried a firm conviction. She mentioned having looked at a few places earlier that day and declared her intention to move out and live on her own. Jywin, still trying to understand the sudden turn of events, asked why she would say such a thing. Her response was quiet, filled with guilt. She confessed that their living arrangement may have held him back, that because they were always together, he no longer seemed interested in connecting with anyone else. She feared she had unintentionally ruined his chance at something more. Later that same night, Jywin found himself outside Kyungga's apartment. The rain hadn't let up, soaking him as he stood at her door. When she opened it and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, concerned by his unexpected visit. She asked what had brought him there in such weather and if something had happened. Without pressing him for details, she urged him to wash up first, saying they could talk afterwards. But Jywin, still damp from the rain and with emotions running high, looked at her and instead suggested that they work out. Kyungga stood frozen for a moment, startled by the unusual request. Her instinct was to remind him that she was Haudu's friend, that there were boundaries she shouldn't cross. But before she could articulate any of this, Jywin spoke again, his voice steady but faintly tinged with desperation. He told her he was fully aware of her connection to Haudu, that it was precisely why he had come. In his mind, she was the only person he could think of at that moment, someone who might understand the situation even partially and offer the kind of support he couldn't find elsewhere. Still met with silence, Jywin took a step back, realizing he may have overstepped. He apologized quietly for showing up so late, his posture already turning toward the door. But before he could leave, Kyungga stopped him. She asked where he thought he was going at such a late hour, especially with the rain pouring down outside. Her tone softened as she told him to wash up first, assuring him that she would wait. Later, alone in her room, Kyungga sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts restless. She replayed his words over and over in her mind. Something had clearly happened, something that had shaken him enough to come to her. She couldn't help but reflect on her own actions, how she had spoken to Haudu recently, whether her frustration had been misplaced, or whether it had been her gesture of support for Jywin the other day that had tangled her further into this complicated web. She wasn't sure how she had ended up here, caught between them, but now that she was, the weight of it began to press down on her. When Jywin returned, freshly showered and changed, she looked at him and quietly said that she understood. His expression, the tremble just beneath his calm surface, told her everything. He didn't look well, he looked tired, unmoored, shaken in a way she hadn't seen before. She admitted that after what happened the last time, she felt partially responsible too. Without saying more, she stood up, prepared herself, and together they began the workout session. After they finish a workout session, Kyungga was glad that it's over and was about to go wash up, but Jywin claims that he wants them to do another session of workout, which she was surprised by. She tries to explain that it's hard to do 2 workout sessions in a row, but Jywin claims that it's okay as he even felt more energetic than before, to which they proceed to another session of workout. As the workout session wound down and the tension in the room gradually eased, with a hint of hesitation but a growing sense of familiarity, she remarked that he actually looked better without his glasses, asking if he had ever considered not wearing them. The comment, casual on the surface, carried with it a quiet curiosity, perhaps even an unexpected tenderness that neither of them acknowledged directly. By the following morning, Haudu lay motionless on her bed, the weight of last night's memories surfacing in fragmented flashes. Her words, heavy with finality and emotion, played back in her head. For a moment, she opened her eyes abruptly, uncertain whether it had all been real or just a strange dream born of exhaustion and drink. But as the clarity of morning settled in, the truth followed with it. Meanwhile, Jywin was already on his way home, the cool morning air brushing against his skin. He felt lighter, as though the burden he had been carrying had briefly loosened its grip. When he entered the apartment, he was surprised to see Haisu already up. She looked at him, her tone casual as she asked if he was just getting back from school. He hesitated, then mentioned that he had thought it was a public holiday, only to realize too late that he had forgotten. Haisu, unfazed, smiled faintly and said it was all right, she had taken the day off as well. In the kitchen, she busied herself with preparing breakfast. As she stirred the pot, a quiet thought crossed her mind. Human beings are such delusional creatures. From across the room, Jywin looked at her, sensing an odd peace in the moment and telling himself that maybe things really were getting better. But as soon as the thought formed, he felt a quiet alarm. That kind of thinking, he knew, was often the most dangerous because it was when one believed things were fine that the cracks started spreading unnoticed. Haisu called out to him from the stove, saying the stew was almost ready and asking if she should wait for him to finish his rice before serving it. He responded with a simple yes, trying to match her normalcy. Yet beneath that surface, his thoughts were tangled. He had assumed that everything would improve after the emotional release he experienced with Kyunga, but instead, he found his mind even more clouded. The sense of freedom he had gained had only made him more aware of the tensions around him and inside himself. He stared off, lost in thought, until Haisu's voice cut through the haze. She looked surprised and delighted, noting that he had eaten all the beans. He quickly replied that they were delicious, to which she smiled brightly, saying he seemed more like an adult now. The lightness in her tone was genuine, and she followed it by mentioning her plans to do a deep cleaning of the apartment for the first time in a while. She asked if he would help her, and he agreed without hesitation. Together, they moved through the apartment, cleaning side by side. Yet even as he dusted and swept, Jywin's focus drifted. His movements were mechanical, his mind caught in a quiet tug-of-war. He realized with growing concern that if this dissonance continued, it would eventually become a serious problem. He needed something to re-anchor himself, perhaps a new focus or shared tasks that required more than just surface cooperation. Haisu interrupted his thoughts again, this time handing him a piece of dirty cloth and asking if he could wash it. He took it in his hands, his pulse quickening slightly. The simplicity of the task somehow made him nervous, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the day might still hold unexpected turns. He quietly wondered if he would be able to make it through without anything slipping out of place. As Jywin paused mid-motion, visibly flustered, Haisu glanced at him curiously, asking what was wrong. He quickly brushed it off, claiming he had only been wondering if there was anything else he could help with. Without waiting for a response, he took the damp cloth and excused himself, promising to be right back. Left alone for a moment, Haisu tilted her head slightly, puzzled. She couldn't quite place it, but something about the way he was acting struck her as unusual. Her hand subconsciously brushed across her face as she wondered if there might be something on it, something out of place that was making him behave so nervously. In the bathroom, Jywin stood over the sink, watching the cloth soak in the cold water. He let out a slow, quiet breath, frustrated with himself. These were the moments that always threw him off, simple, ordinary moments that somehow felt too close, too fragile. He knew he needed to clear his head and stay focused. Just concentrate on the task like always. That was all he had to do. He returned and handed the cloth back to her, asking in a more composed tone if there was anything else she needed him to do. Haisu, casually taking the cloth, remarked that it had been a while since she last cleaned the floor, and there was quite a bit of dust buildup underneath. Jywin nodded, though inwardly he felt his focus slipping again. He caught himself and gave his head a slight shake, forcing the thoughts away. He then offered to clean the bathroom instead, telling himself it was best to put some distance between them, just for now. But even with his attempt to avoid proximity, the nature of their task didn't allow for much separation. Cleaning, as mundane as it was, required them to cross paths frequently, handing each other tools, adjusting furniture, or navigating tight corners. Despite his efforts to stay detached, there were numerous small moments when he had no choice but to assist her, lifting boxes or holding things steady. Each time she thanked him, her tone casual and sincere, he found himself more unsettled. It was a precarious balance, and he could feel himself inching closer to his limits. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the apartment gleamed. The air was still, quiet, and tinged with the golden hue of evening. Jywin slumped into a chair, his back aching slightly, and remarked with genuine disbelief how exhausting it had been just to clean the place. Haisu chuckled and thanked him warmly for all his help, her expression relaxed and cheerful. She then asked if he wanted to shower first, but he declined, telling her to go ahead and wash up first. For a moment, he allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief. The cleaning was done, and it had gone well, more or less. Just as he began to think the ordeal was over, Haisu turned back to him, her tone light but tired. She mentioned that her shoulders were sore from the effort and asked if he could help massage them. Caught off guard, Jywin hesitated. Still, without a word, he moved behind her and began to press gently at her shoulders. His hands were careful, unsure. Though he tried to stay calm, his heart betrayed him with every flustered breath. Haisu, still seated on the floor, let out a soft sigh of relief and smiled faintly, thanking Jywin for the massage. With a tired yet genuine expression, she remarked how glad she was to have him around, how comforting it was, simply having him there with her. The words barely settled in the air when Jywin suddenly stood up. Without turning to face her, he told her not to ask him for something like that again. His voice was quiet but firm, layered with restraint. He explained that it was difficult for him, too difficult, and because of that, he didn't like it. Before she could say anything in return, he added that he was going out to meet a friend and walked out, leaving Haisu stunned by his abruptness and unsure of what had just gone wrong. Later that evening, Jywin was seen at Kyunga's apartment. The room was dimly lit, the television screen casting soft shadows as it played a segment from a fashion program. Kyunga appeared on screen, confidently introducing the dress she was wearing and explaining its design details with practiced poise. From where he sat, Jywin watched her intently, visibly calmer than he had been earlier. He remarked with a hint of admiration that she really sounded intelligent when she was working. Kyunga, catching the comment, turned her head slightly and looked at him with narrowed eyes, half amused, half annoyed. She shot back, asking if that meant he thought she wasn't usually like that. If he was here just to tease her, she told him he should go bother Haisu instead. But Jywin shook his head lightly, his expression more serious now. He explained that, at least for the time being, he needed to maintain some distance from Haisu. Curious and slightly concerned, Kyunga asked what was going on. Jywin, struggling to find the right words, admitted that being near Haisu made his feelings waver. The honesty of his confession caught her off guard, and to her own surprise, she found herself a little excited by his vulnerability. With a light chuckle, she teased that she might actually have a knack for parenting after all. Still, she reminded him that Haisu might worry if he just disappeared, so he should avoid leaving without saying anything. Jywin nodded in understanding and said he had originally planned to ask his seniors or friends if they could let him stay over for a while. However, it quickly became clear that he had misread Kyunga's earlier words. She had only intended to offer him a place to rest temporarily, but not necessarily as a long-term refuge. Still, seeing his earnestness, she decided to play along at least for the night and told him to remember the passcode to her door just in case he ever needed it. A few days later, within the sleek confines of a meeting room, Jihu stood confidently at the front, guiding the team through a detailed presentation on a new business proposal. His voice carried the weight of professionalism, but amidst the attentive nods and scribbled notes, Haisu appeared visibly detached. Though seated upright with her notepad open, her eyes kept flickering toward her phone screen, betraying the pretense of engagement. Her thoughts drifted elsewhere, specifically to the lingering silence from Jywin, whose absence had grown more conspicuous with each passing day. The sudden distance he had placed between them was beginning to feel deliberate, and as the moments ticked by, she quietly questioned whether she had unknowingly made a mistake that drove him away. Just then, her phone buzzed, lighting up with Jywin's name on the screen. With barely concealed urgency, she rose from her seat, offering a brief apology under the guise of an important call that demanded her immediate attention, promising to return shortly. However, upon answering, it was not Jywin's voice she heard but that of Sungbik, who politely introduced himself as Jywin's friend. He explained that Jywin had asked him to call in his stead as he was tied up in a project meeting and would be running late. Haisu, hiding her surprise, acknowledged the message with a neutral tone, noting how Jywin seemed to be increasingly preoccupied these days. Elsewhere, far removed from any meeting, Jywin was seen casually chatting with a fellow student with no sign of urgency. As Sungbik handed him back his phone, he couldn't help but comment on Jywin's recent aloofness, jokingly accusing him of having had a fallout with his mother, especially unusual given Jywin's typically affectionate mama's boy persona. Jywin, maintaining his composure, dismissed the notion, insisting that his mind was simply overloaded with work. Still, a hint of unease clung to his words as he admitted that certain matters, though mostly resolved, continued to weigh on him. In an effort to lighten the mood, he suggested they go out for a drink, which caught Sungbik off guard, more so when Jywin casually mentioned the possibility of inviting a girl to join them. Later that evening, the setting shifted to a lively bar filled with the low hum of music and the clinking of glasses. Sungbik sat at a corner table, his curiosity piqued as Suryan arrived, her presence drawing an excited reaction from him. Just behind her came a friend, someone Sungbik had never seen before, prompting him to nudge Jywin with a half-whispered question about the unfamiliar woman. Jywin, appearing nonchalant, simply stated that he had made an open invitation in the group chat and hadn't kept track of who might actually show up. As the evening unfolded, yet another familiar face entered, their senior from university, who jovially declared that he had come to treat his juniors to drinks. Without hesitation, he pulled up a chair and made himself part of the gathering. Amidst the growing crowd, the overlapping conversations, and the laughter spilling over the table, Sungbik leaned back slightly, scanning the scene in bewilderment. It dawned on him, with a mix of amusement and disbelief, that Jywin had somehow orchestrated what felt like an impromptu mixer party without fully intending to. At the bar, amidst the clinking of glasses and the dim buzz of casual conversation, Suyin's friend, Sujin, sat stiffly in her seat, her expression betraying a growing sense of regret. She had followed Suyin here on a whim, caught up in the spontaneity of the invitation, but now she found herself wishing she had stayed home. The atmosphere felt off from the start. What was supposed to be a casual get-together had somehow morphed into a strange, unbalanced gathering. The venue itself felt inappropriate, given that Jywin, the supposed organizer, was someone known to avoid alcohol entirely and yet had inexplicably chosen a bar as the setting. To make matters worse, Haudu, their senior, was growing increasingly persistent in encouraging Suyin to drink, all while Sungbik, a known heavy drinker, had already gone through several rounds. But what unsettled Sujin the most wasn't the alcohol or even Haudu's thinly veiled attempts at flirtation, it was Suyin's composure. She remained seated among the men without a hint of discomfort, as though the situation was completely normal. Sujin couldn't understand it. Despite her mounting unease, she couldn't bring herself to leave, unwilling to abandon Suyin in such questionable company. Eventually, resignation took hold and she reached for a drink herself, thinking it might help her endure the evening. Not long after, Haudu noticed her taking a sip and seized the moment to suggest they play a game together rather than sit around drinking in silence. His tone was light, but Sujin saw through it instantly. Her response came sharp and clear. She told him outright that she understood exactly what he was trying to do and that she would be keeping a close watch on him. Haudu, slightly taken aback, quickly tried to brush off her suspicions, insisting that his only goal was to ensure the juniors had a good time. Just then, Jywin chimed in, stating that he too wanted to play, his energy drawing Suyin's interest as well, who agreed with a surprising eagerness. Sujin stared at them both, momentarily stunned by their sudden enthusiasm, wondering if she was the only one in the group who couldn't find anything enjoyable about the gathering. Around them, empty bottles continued to accumulate, forming a small collection at the edge of the table. Amid the laughter, Haudu made a casual remark that Sungbik had once again lost the game and with a smirk questioned whether he had ever actually understood how to play. When Sungbik looked visibly drunk, Haudu turned to Jywin and asked him to take the other man outside for a moment to sober up. Jywin leaned in and offered to take Sungbik's drink if he couldn't manage it, but Sungbik stubbornly shook his head and downed it himself. Haudu, visibly annoyed by the repetitive outcome, muttered that it wasn't any fun if the same people kept getting caught. To liven things up, he asked a question that triggered a slurred, nonsensical answer from Sungbik, prompting an exasperated Haudu to swat him lightly on the head and demand that he pull himself together. Recognizing the situation was spiraling, Jywin helped Sungbik out of the bar for some air. Outside, the night air did little to sober Sungbik, who swayed slightly as he turned to Jywin with an apologetic look. He asked if he had ruined the mood and confessed that he always became awkward and tongue-tied around women, feeling like his presence was nothing but a letdown. Jywin, however, was quick to reassure him, saying that he had actually enjoyed himself and that Sungbik's clumsy joke had genuinely made him laugh. As they stood there, a taxi pulled up to the curb. Sungbik watched as Jywin climbed in, murmured something unintelligible, and disappeared into the night. Not long after, Jywin arrived at a quiet apartment, the light from the hallway spilling softly across the floor. Inside, Kyunga was asleep on the couch, her phone clutched loosely in her hand as though she had drifted off while waiting. For a moment, Jywin hesitated, debating whether to wake her or carry her to her bedroom. Meanwhile, back at her apartment, Haisu sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, her fingers hesitating over the screen as she tried once again to call Jywin. The line didn't go through, just as it hadn't the last few times. A quiet frustration began to build in her chest, but more than that, a growing sense of unease. Jywin had been unusually late every day for the past week, and tonight he hadn't come back at all. It was unlike him. He was never the type to stay out without notice, never the kind to leave someone wondering. She stared at the screen in silence, her thoughts spiraling as she questioned whether something might have happened, or worse, if something had already begun to change between them. Her thoughts returned to earlier in the week, to a moment that hadn't sat right with her. They had been cleaning the house together, an ordinary enough activity, but she had sensed something different in him, a kind of distance, quiet but unmistakable. He hadn't spoken much, his responses brief, his eyes often elsewhere. At the time, she had brushed it off as fatigue, but now it came back to her with unsettling clarity. And then, like a puzzle piece slipping into place, she remembered the dream, or what she thought was a dream, where she had told Jywin she was thinking of moving out and living alone. It dawned on her that it hadn't been a dream at all. She had actually said those words out loud. She didn't know what compelled her to say it or if she meant it fully, but now she feared he had taken it seriously and that perhaps it had created a quiet wall between them. Elsewhere, Jywin stood in the small, cluttered living room of Kyungga's apartment, his body stiff with hesitation as he considered doing a bit of working out. Turning slightly, he saw Kyungga shifting awake on the couch, her eyes half open as she slowly sat up, still drowsy from sleep. Her voice was barely above a whisper edged with confusion as she looked at him and asked what he was doing. Jywin, caught off guard, stiffened with surprise, unsure of what to say, the moment suspended between them in the dim light of the quiet apartment. Kyungga, having regained her composure after waking up to find Jywin moving around in the dark, gave him a light scolding, telling him to stop fooling around and not to disturb her rest like that again. Though her tone was firm, she couldn't shake the feeling that he looked oddly guilty, almost as if her mild reprimand had weighed on him more than intended. Watching his reaction, she began to wonder if perhaps she had been too harsh, if maybe he had just needed an outlet for something weighing on his mind. A moment later, softening her stance, she told him that she was going to sleep now and gently suggested that he go inside to get some rest as well. She added that he could take the bed for the night, insisting she'd just sleep on the couch. Despite the offer, Jywin found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling in the dimly lit room. Whether it was the alcohol lingering in his system or the unrest in his thoughts, sleep simply wouldn't come. His mind drifted through a fog of memories, doubts, and words unsaid. He shifted restlessly beneath the blanket, his eyes occasionally flicking to the closed door as if expecting something or someone to appear. Meanwhile, in the living room, Kyungga was also struggling to fall back asleep. Perhaps it was the sudden interruption earlier, or maybe it was the awareness that someone else was now in her space, someone who carried with him a tension she couldn't quite read. Eventually, the soft creak of a door opening broke the silence. Jywin emerged from the room, his footsteps quiet as he padded across the floor. He had given up trying to sleep. The silence in the room didn't soothe him, it only made the unease louder. As Kyungga wasn't asleep either. Kyungga found herself in disbelief as she realized Jywin was once again preparing to begin his workout right there in the living room, just as he had done before. The situation felt strangely familiar, yet something about it felt markedly different this time. Back then, she had gone along with it under the belief that she was doing it for the sake of both Jywin and Haisu, for their relationship, their stability. But now, with Haisu no longer part of the immediate picture and the air between her and Jywin carrying an unspoken tension, she questioned what exactly this moment meant. It no longer felt like something she was merely overseeing or enduring for someone else's sake. As Jywin moved with quiet determination, beginning to stretch and ease into his routine, Kyungga stepped forward, halting him with a few words, her voice tinged with concern. She reminded him of the time, insisting it was already late and urging him to go to sleep. But Jywin, with a weary look in his eyes, explained that he wanted nothing more than to rest, yet he simply couldn't fall asleep unless he first allowed his mind and body to wind down through movement. Despite her reluctance, Kyungga could see the sincerity in him. He wasn't doing this out of restlessness or whim. He was trying, in his own quiet way, to calm something unresolved within himself. And so, when he insisted on continuing, even inviting her to join him slightly just to get through it, she found herself unable to turn him away. She hesitated at first, but eventually let the moment unfold. As the workout began between them, Kyungga's thoughts drifted once more to Haisu. A pang of guilt stirred in her chest, realizing how easily these private, late-night moments could be misinterpreted and how hard it would be to explain them if taken at face value. Still, she told herself that this wasn't about anything else. This was about helping Jywin find a bit of peace, about allowing him the chance to sleep. Kyungga had been patiently enduring Jywin's relentless energy for a while, observing how immersed he was in what he was doing. It became increasingly clear that he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. She knew she had a full day ahead at work, and the thought of showing up sleep-deprived was far from appealing. With this in mind, she made it a point to draw his attention, gently reminding him of the time and urging him, albeit with some firmness, to bring his enthusiastic efforts to a close. She allowed him to continue with his workout session. Time passed slowly but surely. Eventually, as the early morning hues began to stretch across the sky, Jywin reached a point of contentment and finally brought his workout session to a halt. Sensing the brief silence that followed, Kyungga took the opportunity to pull herself together. She rose, preparing mentally and physically for the day ahead, intending to start breakfast and get herself ready for work. But just as she thought the moment of peace had arrived, she became aware of Jywin's lingering presence and his undiminished eagerness. Despite her subtle attempts to dissuade him, urging him to let her go about her morning routine, Jywin seemed deaf to her reluctance and continued pressing forward, driven by the same stubborn energy that had carried him through the night. Kyunga, now more exasperated than surprised, was about to protest more seriously when the unexpected sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. Seeing an opportunity for temporary escape, she quickly announced her intent to answer the door, assuming it was the delivery she had scheduled. Reluctantly, Jywin stepped aside just enough to let her walk away, though he remained physically close, still pursuing her attention even as she moved to the entrance. As she opened the door, with Jywin unyieldingly hovering behind her, a creeping sense of anxiety surged through her. The possibility of someone seeing them in such an awkward and compromising situation flashed through her mind. Before she could fully brace herself, she heard her name being called out with unmistakable familiarity. The voice belonged to none other than Haisu. Suyin was at home that morning, preparing to step out when an unexpected encounter in the living room caused her to pause. As she descended the hallway and entered the room, she was surprised to see her father seated there. His presence was unusual at that hour, considering his typically early departure for work. The surprise on her face was mirrored by the subtle disapproval in his eyes as he regarded her with a stern expression that carried unspoken expectations. He observed her appearance and, sensing her sluggish demeanor, commented on her seemingly late start to the day. Inwardly, she wondered why he had not already left for the newsroom where his demanding responsibilities as a seasoned journalist usually kept him occupied from the early hours. The brief silence between them was quickly filled by a more probing inquiry from him as he shifted the conversation toward the events of the previous night. With a careful tone, he questioned her about her late return home, subtly masking his concern behind a veil of paternal authority. Suyin, unwilling to delve into specifics, gave a vague explanation about spending time with friends. Her father, however, was not easily convinced. Years of investigative reporting had sharpened his instincts, and he could tell from her hesitance that she was not being entirely truthful. His suspicion grew, and he voiced his belief that she had instead been with a man. She didn't offer a rebuttal, and her silence only seemed to confirm his assumptions. With a deep sigh, her father shifted from interrogation to caution. He revealed that troubling rumors had begun to circulate, whispers about her behavior that could easily gain traction if given attention. As the election season loomed near, tensions in their household had grown, not just because of political fervor, but because of the delicate nature of his profession. His investigative work, particularly aimed at uncovering damaging truths about rival candidates, required a careful public image both for himself and his family. The mere possibility of scandal, even if born from exaggeration, could be weaponized in the volatile world of media and politics. It was with this in mind that he urged her to remain inconspicuous, to avoid doing anything that might draw unnecessary attention. He stressed the importance of maintaining a quiet and composed presence, likening it to that of a mouse, silent, cautious, and unseen. Until the elections concluded or until she eventually married and moved into a place of her own, he insisted that she refrain from indulging in any of the behaviors that, in his view, brought her the wrong kind of attention. At that moment, Suyin could no longer endure the weight of her father's words. The pressure, the criticism, the relentless need to fit into the quiet mold he had crafted for her, each sentence had settled like lead on her chest. Without another glance at him, she turned on her heel and bolted up the stairs, retreating to the only place where she still felt she had a sliver of control, her room. Once inside, she shut the door behind her with a trembling hand as though trying to seal herself off from the world beyond. She began to frantically search through her drawers and shelves until she found her old journal and a pen, the same tools she often turned to when she needed to translate emotion into something tangible. Without pausing, she sat down and began scribbling, listing every action her father had forbidden her to do, each one marked like a crime on a record she didn't remember signing. But the truth was, the more she tried to suppress those impulses, the more suffocated she became, as though each act of obedience slowly drained the oxygen from her lungs. Despite the vastness of the mansion they lived in, with its marble floors and sprawling corridors, she now felt like a ghost wandering through a place where she could never truly be unseen. It became clear that the size of the house only amplified her father's watchful presence. So, she began hiding in the smallest corner she could find, a space not big enough to stretch her limbs, but somehow large enough to hold her thoughts. There, hunched over with pen to paper, she wrote as if the ink itself could create a door. And as she scribbled through her haze of frustration and yearning, a name surfaced in her mind, Jywin. The moment he appeared in her thoughts, everything she'd been trying to suppress collapsed inwards. Her focus fractured, and the clarity she had while writing was suddenly replaced with a storm of emotion. She couldn't think straight anymore. Elsewhere, in the early stillness of morning at Kyunghwa's house, Haisu had shown up unannounced. She arrived with an apologetic expression, explaining that she had something weighing on her mind, something important enough to bring her there on her way to work. Hoping not to intrude too much, she politely asked if she could come inside so they could talk in private. Unbeknownst to her, Jywin was still inside the house. Upon hearing Haisu's familiar voice from the doorway, he froze where he stood. A sudden tension ran through him, and instead of stepping back or making his presence known, he instinctively moved behind Kyungha, gripping her gently but tightly, hoping that his body would stay hidden in the narrow sliver of space she occupied. He clung to her like a child caught doing something forbidden, desperate not to be seen. As Haisu received no answer, she spoke again, noting her limited time and expressing her wish to speak with Kyungha as soon as possible. At that point, Kyungha carefully leaned her head out through the barely opened door and informed Haisu that now was not a good time. From Kyungha's appearance and demeanor, Haisu quickly gathered that nothing was seriously wrong. Relieved yet embarrassed by her impulsive visit, she apologized for coming without warning. She told Kyungha she would come back another time, then turned to leave. Once the door was shut again, a wave of relief swept through Jywin. He exhaled, thankful that they had narrowly avoided an uncomfortable discovery. Without saying much, he made his way toward the bedroom, intending to get dressed. Kyungha stood quietly for a moment, surprised by the sudden shift in him. His casual attitude, his lack of remorse for what had just nearly occurred, left her stunned. He moved as though nothing had happened, as if there were no emotional weight to their closeness or near exposure. He simply went about his business, explaining with a calm detachment that Haisu's tone earlier suggested she might be concerned about him, and so he planned to return home and reach out to her. Later that night, Jywin returned to Haisu's apartment and, after a long day, quietly retreated to the guest room where he now sometimes stayed. As sleep finally began to pull him under, the door creaked open softly. Without knocking or announcing herself, Haisu stepped into the dimly lit room. Without Jywin's knowledge, Haisu had joined him for a workout, moving alongside him in the same space, and she allowed herself the quiet thrill of being near him while remaining unnoticed. The following day, as she arrived at work, a subtle shift in her composure became evident. She struggled to maintain focus on even the simplest tasks, her mind drifting off into thoughts she couldn't name, much less explain. She became easily distracted, her eyes often fixed on nothing in particular, and even when her name was called, she would fail to respond until someone physically tapped her shoulder. Only then would she return to the present, startled, offering hurried apologies for her delayed reaction. One such moment occurred when she was informed that the director had been calling for her. Quickly regaining her composure, she apologized for the oversight and with a respectful nod followed the director as he led her to his office. The atmosphere inside the room was calm but carried an undertone of concern. The director, after settling into his chair, began by pointing out the recent inconsistencies in the performance of the second team. He expressed genuine confusion over the sudden decline, as the team had previously maintained a steady pace. His observations were firm but not unkind, and as he questioned what might have caused the downturn, Haisu found herself unable to produce any explanation. She sat in silence, weighed down by the realization that she had no justification to offer, only a growing sense of guilt and self-disappointment. The director then shifted the conversation toward her future in the company, stating that unless she was able to stabilize her output and take hold of her path toward an executive position, she would remain in her current standing indefinitely. He noted that her children were thriving and saw no visible reason for her current lack of engagement. Though his words were direct, there was a trace of compassion in his tone, and he gently encouraged her to open up about her burdens before they became too overwhelming to manage. He reminded her that speaking to someone, anyone, could ease the weight she carried. Grateful for his concern, she offered a quiet expression of thanks and took her leave from his office. Seeking a moment of solitude, she made her way to the restroom where the polished silence gave her space to think. As she stood alone, the director's words echoed in her mind. She tried to search within herself for the root of her emotional unrest but found no clear answers. Everything felt clouded, unresolved. Despite the suggestion to talk to someone, the idea of opening up felt impossible. She questioned whether she could bring herself to speak about something she hadn't even come to understand. Ultimately, she dismissed the thought of sharing her concerns with anyone, convinced that it would not lead to relief. It dawned on her that everything seemed to have shifted ever since the boy she had cared for over the years, once just a child needing guidance, had grown into a man. He had begun to regard her differently, no longer with the innocent gaze of a dependent but with the quiet awareness of someone who now saw her as a woman. This subtle transformation in his demeanor had not escaped her, and though no words were exchanged to confirm it, she sensed it in the way he looked at her, in the tension that sometimes lingered in their shared silences. Though they shared no blood ties, the nature of their relationship had always felt familial, structured around responsibility and care. That understanding had anchored her for so long that anything else felt unnatural, something that simply should not be.